beyond the bars. The fluorescent
lights of Riverside Women's
Correctional Facility hummed their monotonous song as Officer Maya Rodriguez walked the East Wing corridor for what felt like the 1,000th time, her boots echoing against cold concrete floors stained with decades of despair. She had learned long ago to keep her eyes forward, her expression neutral, her heart carefully locked away behind the same steel barriers that separated freedom from captivity. But on this particular Tuesday morning in October, everything she thought she knew about maintaining professional distance would shatter the moment. She looked into cell 17 and saw Sarah Chen sitting on her bunk, tears streaming silently down her face as she clutched a letter that had clearly delivered devastating news. Maya had been a corrections officer for 7 years, ever since she graduated from the academy with honors and a determination to make a difference in a system that seemed designed to break people rather than rehabilitate them. She had seen every kind of inmate, heard every kind of story, witnessed every form of human suffering that these walls contained. She prided herself on her ability to remain compassionate yet detached, fair yet firm. The job demanded it. Getting emotionally involved with inmates was not just discouraged. It was grounds for immediate termination and possibly criminal charges depending on the nature of the involvement. The rules existed for good reasons, her training officer had told her repeatedly. Inmates were master manipulators, and even the most well-intentioned officer could find themselves compromised, their career destroyed, their reputation ruined. Maya had internalized these warnings so thoroughly that they had become part of her DNA, woven into every interaction she had within these walls. Sarah Chen had arrived at Riverside 6 months earlier, sentenced to 3 years for vehicular manslaughter. Her file told a story that Maya had read countless times in her career. A single tragic moment that had irrevocably altered the course of a young woman's life. Sarah had been driving home from her nursing shift at the children's hospital when she fell asleep at the wheel. After pulling a double shift to cover for a sick colleague, her car had crossed the center line and collided with another vehicle, killing a 62-year-old grandfather instantly. The toxicology report showed she hadn't been drinking or using drugs. She was simply exhausted, a crime that seemed to carry a punishment far exceeding the nature of her terrible mistake. At 28 years old, Sarah was now an inmate, her nursing license permanently revoked, her entire future reduced to a prison identification number and a release date that felt impossibly distant. What struck Maya about Sarah from the beginning was how different she seemed from most of the other women in the facility. While many inmates arrived angry, defiant, or already hardened by previous incarceration, Sarah moved through the prison like a ghost haunting the scene of her own life's destruction. She was quiet, compliant, and seemed to carry the weight of her guilt like physical chains that were far heavier than any restraints the institution could impose. She attended every rehabilitation program offered, worked diligently in the prison library, and helped other inmates write letters to their children in the careful, neat handwriting of someone who had once documented medical charts with precision and care. She never caused trouble, never complained, never seemed to hope for anything beyond making it through each day without completely falling apart. The other inmates respected her quiet dignity, and even the most hardened corrections officers found themselves speaking a little more gently when addressing her, as if they could sense that she was already punishing herself far more severely than the justice system ever could. Maya told herself that her interest in Sarah's well-being was purely professional, that checking on her more frequently than other inmates was simply good correctional practice for someone who seemed particularly vulnerable to self-harm. She convinced herself that the extra attention she paid during mealtimes, ensuring Sarah was actually eating and not just pushing food around her tray, was about maintaining institutional order and preventing medical emergencies. When she volunteered to supervise the library where Sarah worked, Maya rationalized it as taking on additional responsibility to advance her career. But deep down, in a place she refused to acknowledge even to herself, Maya knew that something had shifted inside her the first time their eyes met, during intake processing, when Sarah had looked at her with such profound sadness and acceptance that Maya had felt her carefully, constructed emotional walls, cracked just slightly. The letter that Sarah held that October morning was from her younger brother, the only family member who still maintained contact with her. Their parents had disowned Sarah after the sentencing, unable to reconcile the daughter they had raised with the person who had taken an innocent life. Her brother's letter brought news that their mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer and had perhaps 6 months to live. Despite multiple requests from her brother, their mother refused to speak with Sarah, refused to grant forgiveness, refused to allow her daughter one final conversation before death made reconciliation permanently impossible. As Maya approached the cell to conduct her routine morning count, she saw Sarah's shoulders shaking with silent sobs, watched as the letter slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the concrete floor like a wounded bird falling from the sky. Maya's training told her to move on, to maintain emotional distance, to remind herself that inmates dealt with personal tragedies all the time, and showing preferential treatment or emotional support to one over others could create dangerous precedents. But something in Sarah's absolute despair, in the way she seemed to be physically collapsing under the weight of compounded grief and guilt, made Maya stop outside the cell. She found herself asking if Sarah needed to speak with the prison counselor, found herself speaking in a voice so gentle it surprised even herself. Sarah looked up, and when their eyes met, Maya saw such raw vulnerability, such desperate need for simple human kindness, that she made a decision that would alter both of their lives irrevocably. She radioed to her supervisor that she was escorting an inmate to a counseling session, and then did something that violated multiple protocols. She took Sarah to an empty interview room, closed the door, and for 15 minutes, she simply let Sarah cry while offering tissues and a presence that communicated, without words, that she was seen, that her pain mattered, that she was still human despite the walls surrounding her. That moment of compassionate connection opened a door that Maya had worked 7 years to keep firmly locked. Over the following weeks, she found herself seeking out opportunities to speak with Sarah, brief conversations during library supervision that gradually extended from professional check-ins to genuine exchanges about books they both loved, about the injustices of a system that punished exhaustion as severely as malice, about the impossible burden of guilt that no amount of incarceration could ever satisfy. Sarah began to emerge slightly from her shell of grief, and Maya discovered that beneath the sorrow was a woman of extraordinary intelligence, deep empathy, and quiet strength. Sarah spoke about her work at the Children's Hospital with such passion that Maya could see the nurse she had once been, the person who had dedicated her life to healing others and now had to live with the knowledge that she had ended a life instead. They talked about Sarah's love of literature, and Maya brought her books from her personal collection, carefully documenting them as library additions to avoid raising suspicion. They discussed philosophy and ethics, the nature of redemption, and whether it was possible to atone for unintentional harm, whether forgiveness from others mattered when you could never forgive yourself. Maya knew she was crossing lines that should never be crossed, but she justified each small transgression as harmless, as simply providing enhanced rehabilitation support to an inmate who was genuinely trying to better herself. She told herself that their connection was mentorship, that her growing desire to see Sarah smile was professional satisfaction in helping an inmate heal. But late at night, lying in her apartment alone, Maya could no longer deny what was happening. She was falling in love with Sarah Chen, deeply and irrevocably, in a way that terrified her and filled her with a joy she had never experienced before. She had dated other women throughout her 20s, had even lived with a partner for 2 years before the relationship ended amicably when they realized they wanted different futures, but nothing in her romantic history had prepared her for the intensity of what she felt for Sarah. The way her heart raced when she saw her during shift changes, the way she counted down hours until their next library session, the way she lay awake imagining a future that seemed impossible, where Sarah was free and they could simply be 2 women who loved each other without the specter of institutional power dynamics and criminal consequences hanging over them. Sarah felt it too, though she fought against her own emotions. With even more determination than Maya, she knew what it meant for Maya if their connection was discovered. knew that a corrections officer losing her career for falling in love with an inmate would face not just job loss but potential prosecution, public humiliation, and the permanent destruction of her reputation. Sarah had already destroyed her own life and the life of an innocent man. She told herself repeatedly that she would not be responsible for destroying Maya's future as well. But despite her best efforts to maintain distance, despite deliberately avoiding eye contact and trying to limit their conversations, Sarah found herself falling into Maya's kindness like someone drowning, finally finding the surface after being underwater for too long. For the first time since the accident, she felt seen as a complete person, rather than just her worst moment, felt valued for who she was rather than defined solely by her crime. In Maya's presence, she could briefly forget the crushing weight of her guilt and remember what it felt like to simply be Sarah, to laugh at something genuinely funny, to discuss ideas with intellectual curiosity, to feel the flutter of attraction, and the warmth of being cared for by someone who knew the worst about her and still chose to see her humanity. The dangerous moment came on a February evening, during a lockdown drill when Maya found herself alone with Sarah in the library supply closet, both of them seeking shelter during what they thought was a genuine emergency before realizing it was just a scheduled exercise. In that small, dark space, standing close enough to feel each other's breath, the tension that had been building for months finally became impossible to ignore. Maya knew she should step back, should maintain the professional boundary, should radio in and request a different officer escort Sarah back to her cell. But instead, she reached out and gently touched Sarah's face, traced the line of her jaw with trembling fingers, and whispered that she knew this was wrong, knew all the reasons they couldn't do this, but that she had never felt about anyone the way she felt about her. Sarah responded by closing the small distance between them and pressing her lips to Maya's in a kiss that tasted of desperation and longing and the terrible sweetness of forbidden connection. For 2 minutes, they allowed themselves to exist in a reality where they were just two women kissing in the dark, where their circumstances didn't matter, where love was simple rather than impossibly complicated. Then reality crashed back, and they pulled apart, both breathing heavily, both knowing they had crossed a line from which there was no return. What followed was 6 months of exquisite agony and stolen moments that existed in the thin spaces between what was allowed and what was forbidden. They never kissed again on prison property, both understanding that the risk of discovery was too high and the consequences too severe, but their emotional intimacy deepened into something that felt more profound than any physical relationship Maya had ever experienced. They wrote letters to each other that Sarah would destroy immediately after reading, pouring out their hearts in words they could never speak aloud within the prison walls. Maya used her days off to research legal precedents, trying to find some pathway that would allow them to be together once Sarah was released without destroying Maya's career in the process. She consulted with lawyers without revealing the specifics of her situation, learning that corrections officers were generally prohibited from having relationships with former inmates for a period of time after release, though the exact duration and consequences varied by jurisdiction and circumstance. The more she researched, the more impossible their situation seemed. But she couldn't bring herself to walk away from the only person who had ever made her feel so completely alive and understood. Sarah's mother passed away in April without ever speaking to her daughter again, a loss that devastated Sarah in ways that her initial incarceration hadn't. Maya held her hand through the bars of her cell late one night after lockdown, a violation that could have ended her career if caught, and let Sarah grieve not just for her mother, but for the relationship they would never repair, for the forgiveness she would never receive, for the daughter she had been before everything fell apart. Maya found herself making a silent promise in that moment that she would love Sarah enough to compensate for all the love that had been withdrawn, that she would see Sarah's goodness clearly enough to balance out Sarah's inability to see it herself, that she would fight for their future even when the odds seemed overwhelming. It was a promise born of love but also of a kind of defiant hope, a refusal to accept that their connection was merely a tragic impossibility rather than something worth protecting and nurturing. The prison administration began to notice Maya's increased attention to Sarah in late spring, Though they couldn't initially pinpoint anything specifically inappropriate, Maya's supervisor called her in for a conversation about maintaining professional boundaries, reminding her that showing preferential treatment to particular inmates could create security risks and undermine institutional fairness. Maya assured her supervisor that her interactions with Sarah were entirely professional and focused on rehabilitation support, but she left the meeting knowing that they were under observation, that any misstep could expose everything. She told Sarah they needed to be more careful, needed to reduce their contact to avoid suspicion. But reducing contact felt like trying to stop breathing, like deliberately choosing suffocation to avoid the risk of drowning. They managed for 3 weeks before finding themselves in deep conversation again, unable to resist the pull of connection that had become essential to both of their emotional survival. The turning point came when Sarah received notification that she was eligible for early release due to good behavior and prison overcrowding. With a parole hearing scheduled for September, suddenly the theoretical future they had dreamed about became a concrete possibility that was both thrilling and terrifying. If Sarah was released, they could potentially be together openly, though they would still face significant obstacles including legal restrictions on officer-inmate relationships, the social stigma of their unconventional origin story, and Sarah's own struggle to rebuild a life outside prison walls. Maya began making plans obsessively, researching jobs in other states where they could start fresh, calculating how long she would need to remain employed at Riverside to protect her pension before she could resign without financial catastrophe. Sarah warned her not to sacrifice her career, not to throw away everything she had built for a future that was still uncertain. But Maya had made her decision with a clarity that surprised even herself. Love, real love, was worth the risk, worth the sacrifice, worth fighting for even when the world seemed designed to keep them apart. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of love to transcend circumstances, and the importance of seeing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their mistakes, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that redemption and connection are always possible. Your support helps these stories reach people who need them most. Sarah's parole hearing was approved, and her release date was set for October 15th, almost exactly 2 years after Maya had first seen her crying in her cell. The days leading up to her release were filled with a mixture of overwhelming hope and paralyzing fear. Maya submitted her resignation from Riverside effective 2 weeks after Sarah's release date, citing personal reasons and thanking the institution for 7 years of professional development. Her colleagues threw her a farewell party where they praised her dedication and expressed confusion about her sudden departure, unable to imagine that the composed, by-the-book officer Rodriguez was walking away from everything for love. Sarah prepared for release with the help of a re-entry program, securing temporary housing and beginning the process of applying for positions that would accept someone with her criminal record, knowing that returning to nursing was impossible, but hoping to find work where she could still help others in some capacity. On the morning of October 15th, Maya stood outside the prison gates in civilian clothes, waiting for Sarah to walk through those doors for the last time. When Sarah emerged, blinking in the bright autumn sunlight, carrying a small bag containing all her worldly possessions, Maya was there to catch her as she stumbled, overwhelmed by the sudden reality of freedom. They held each other for a long moment, not kissing, not speaking, just breathing the same air as two free women who had chosen each other against all odds. Maya drove them to a small apartment, 3 states away, that she had rented using her savings. A modest place with big windows that let in plenty of light and represented the beginning of their new life together. They spent their first night of freedom talking until dawn, making promises to each other about building something real and lasting, about healing together from their respective wounds, about creating a future defined not by the circumstances that brought them together, but by the love they chose to nurture and protect. Their first year together was not easy, as they both grappled with the aftermath of their unconventional beginning. Sarah struggled with PTSD from her incarceration and the unresolved trauma of the accident that had cost a man his life. attending therapy twice weekly and working through layers of guilt that would probably never completely disappear. Maya grieved the loss of her career and the identity she had built around being a corrections officer, sometimes wondering if she had made the right choice. Though every time she looked at Sarah, those doubts evaporated. They faced judgment from some of Maya's former colleagues who learned about their relationship and condemned is as an bout of power even, though Maya had carefully waited until after Sarah's release to make their relationship public. They endured curious stares and invasive questions when Sarah's background check revealed her criminal record during job application, but also discovered a resilience in each other that came from having survived separate hells and chosen to build heaven together.